There she stood at the long wooden table inside the Millhaven Grange Hall, 47 glass jars arranged in 4 neat rows before her, the wax seals still faintly amber from the canning kettle, each lid printed in her own careful hand with a small paper label that read Caldwell's Grove. The October fair had been open for less than 3 hours. Every single jar was gone. Sold, every last one, and the women who had arrived at 9 and found the table already stripped were still standing nearby, asking if there would be more tomorrow. Would there be more next year? Could they leave their names on a list? Maren Caldwell stood with her hands flat on the empty table and looked at the $82.25 she had folded neatly into a tin beside the scale. Her face was as still as the surface of a stock pond at first light. Across the hall, Fletcher Dowd stood near the cider press demonstration with a cup of something he was not drinking, watching her. His jaw was moving the way a man's jaw moves when he is trying to arrange a feeling into something that resembles calm. It was not working especially well. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Maren Caldwell, with her $82.25 and her empty table and her steady hands, Fletcher Dowd and his curdling composure across the room. The smell of wood smoke and cinnamon and something earned hanging in the air between them. We should go back. We should go back almost 2 years to the first day of September in the county's worst storm season in living memory, to the morning Maren Caldwell walked out into her north field and looked at what the night had left behind. But we should go back a little further than that first, because when you saw her standing at that table in October of the following year, steady and unhurried, while the last jar changed hands, you had to understand what the county had said about her the September before, what they had said, and how completely they had meant it. 3 years before the fair, a wet spring took Maren's husband, Odell, not violently, but incrementally, the way certain men who have worked too hard for too long are taken, a chest that thickened with fluid through April and May and did not unknot itself in June. He was 51, she was 46. They had 31 acres on the county road, 11 miles east of Millhaven, acreage that the county tax assessor's office had evaluated the previous autumn at a value slightly less than the cost of clearing and replanting it, which was the assessor's polite way of noting that the land was tired and the orchard on the north end of it was older than anyone could precisely say. 60-some apple trees, varieties that had gone unregistered and nameless through at least 3 generations of owners before the Caldwells arrived, trees so old that their trunks had thickened into something closer to architecture than botany, limbs branching at angles that modern orchardists would not have permitted, unpruned crowns spreading wide and tangled and almost willfully unfashionable. The county extension agent had visited the Caldwell place twice in the decade before Odell died. The first time he had written in his ledger that the orchard was in need of serious remediation and that the varieties present were largely unidentified heirlooms of uncertain commercial value. The second time he had written that the situation had not improved and that the family might consider whether the acreage would be better returned to row crops. He had been kind about it, in the way that people are kind when they are also certain. When Odell died and the county learned that Maren intended to stay on alone, the kindness continued in that same key. Neighbors stopped by with food and sympathy, and the quiet, persistent suggestion that a woman alone on 31 marginal acres with an unmanageable orchard and no hired help ought to think seriously about her options. Her sister in Wichita had a spare room. The Hanfield family, 2 miles south, had been looking to expand their row crop operation, and the north acreage would suit them fine. Fletcher Dowd, who owned the grain elevator and the feed store in Millhaven, and whose opinion on the value of things in the county carried a weight roughly equal to the weight of his bank account, had come by in person, hat in hand, voice low and full of gentleness. He had looked at the orchard and the farmhouse and the sagging equipment shed and made her an offer of $4,200 for the whole of it, land and trees and outbuildings, a price he described as generous given the condition of the place, a price she thanked him for and declined. He had not taken the refusal with cruelty. Exactly. He had taken it the way a man takes an answer he expects eventually to revise. The county had its opinion of Maren Caldwell after that, and its opinion was not unkind, but it was not admiring either. A woman holding on to a place out of grief, they said, which was understandable, but grief was not a farming plan, and the orchard was not an orchard, so much as a stand of old wood, using up ground that could be growing something. 46 years old, widowed, no children, no hired hand, no plan that anyone could see. It was easier, as it is always easier, to believe a place is past saving than to admit you never looked at it closely enough to know. Maren looked at it closely. She had been looking at it closely for 10 years, quietly, in the way that her husband, who loved to talk, had not always noticed. She had walked the orchard in every season and kept her own notes in a composition book she did not show to extension agents. She had tasted the fruit from each of the 63 trees she had personally counted and noted the flavor, the texture, the year's variation, the way certain trees held their fruit long into October, while others dropped early. She knew which 4 trees along the eastern fence line produced an apple with a tartness so pronounced it made your back teeth ache pleasantly, an apple that cooked down to something remarkable. She knew which 12 trees in the center rows bore a fruit so dense and sweet it needed almost nothing added to be preserved. She had been thinking about apple butter for 6 years and had made small batches of it for the house, and said nothing to anyone about what she thought of it, which is to say she had been doing the only arithmetic that mattered and keeping the sum to herself. In the late summer of the year after Odell died, a man named Aurelio Vasco, who had kept a small holding half a mile down the county road since before Maren and Odell had arrived, and who had come originally from a valley somewhere in the Carpathian range of Eastern Europe, and who was then 78 years old and moved as though the years had compacted him into something denser and more patient than ordinary men, stopped her one afternoon while she was walking the fence line and asked her what she meant to do with the orchard. She told him she meant to work it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the clipped, slightly formal English he had never fully shed, a thing she would turn over in her mind many times in the years that followed. He said, a tree that has grown hard in a hard place will outlast the softest grove in the county, and what it gives you will carry in it every year of the difficulty it survived. You cannot buy that in a catalogue. She thanked him. He nodded once and went back to his side of the fence. That was all, but she wrote it down that evening in the composition book. A tree that has grown hard in a hard place will outlast the softest grove in the county, and what it gives you will carry in it every year of the difficulty it survived. She was still turning that sentence over in her mind, rolling it like a smooth stone under the thumb, on the morning of the 2nd of September, when she walked out into the north field and found what the storm had done. It had been a bad system, a mid-rotation low that had swung through the county the night before with sustained winds. The radio called 51 miles per hour and gusts to 68. It had knocked the power out from 9 in the evening until past 3 in the morning. Maren had heard the orchard all night, the groan and percussion of it, and she had not slept and had not expected to. She had made coffee at first light and gone out before the dew was fully off the grass. The orchard floor was covered, not damaged, not depleted, covered. The wind had come at the peak of the pre-harvest period for the early ripeners and had stripped a portion of the crown from nearly every tree in the north, 2 rows, and the fruit lay across the ground in numbers she had never seen at once. She walked the rows slowly, stepping with care, and she counted as she went, not every apple but the rough accumulations by section, and by the time she reached the far fence, she had a number in her head that she brought back inside and wrote down. Somewhere between 380 and 420 apples lay on the ground of that orchard, undamaged in the main, because the summer had been dry and the grass was thick and soft, and they had landed from heights low enough to bruise only the skins, not the flesh. Stormdrop. The county extension office called it Stormdrop and considered it a loss. Fruit on the ground was fruit that could not go to a buyer unsorted, fruit that would rot if not processed within 10 days, fruit that represented, in the conventional arithmetic, a problem. Maren stood in her kitchen with her coffee and did different arithmetic. She did not call the extension office. She did call Delphine Marsh, who was 11 years old and lived 3/4 of a mile east on the county road, with a grandmother who worked double shifts at the diner in Millhaven, and who was, as Maren had observed, over 2 years of neighborly attention, a child with a great deal of time on her hands and a great deal of quiet capability inside that time. Delphine arrived within the hour on her bicycle, said nothing when she saw the orchard floor, simply looked with the level, assessing gaze of a child who has learned not to exclaim at things, and then looked at Maren and said, "What do we do first?" They sorted the apples into 3 categories on the long work table Maren had set up under the equipment shed roof. First pile, firm fruit, minimal bruising, suitable for butter. Second pile, soft fruit, usable but needing immediate processing. Third pile, split or fully bruised, composted. By the end of the second day, they had moved 391 apples through the sorting line. The third pile had claimed 41 of them. The first 2 piles, between them, held 350 apples ready for work. Delphine had named every pile with a small handwritten card held down by a stone. She had also, without being asked, named the project. She had stood back on the afternoon of the first day, looked at the rows of sorted fruit and said, "This is a lot of apples to end up somewhere good." And Maren had found this to be an accurate and sufficient observation. Now here was the matter of the cost of those apples. This is where Fletcher Dude entered the story in its working phase, as opposed to the earlier chapter in which he had entered it as a man with a hat and an offer. Maren had learned early in the autumn of the year before, while laying out in her composition book the rough economics of processing and selling apple butter through the county fair, and, potentially, through the Millhaven General Store, that she would need to establish a price for the raw fruit before the county extension office would process any paperwork related to her applying for a vendor's permit under the value-added agricultural goods provision of the state's Small Producer Act. This was a bureaucratic formality, a box to be filled, but the box required a declared raw material cost per unit, and the raw material, in her case, was storm-dropped fruit from her own trees. She drove to the elevator on a Thursday in late September, a year before the fair, and asked Fletcher Dudd what storm-dropped apples from an unregistered heirloom orchard were worth per unit, commercially speaking. And he looked at her across the counter, with the expression of a man who finds the question slightly amusing. He said, "Maren, Stormdrop is waste fruit. Nobody buys waste fruit." He paused, and then he said, "If you need a number for paperwork, I suppose 2 cents apiece is more than fair. I'd say 1.50 cents, but I'll round up for you." She said, 2 cents apiece will do, and thanked him, and drove home and wrote in her composition book, 400 apples at 2 cents each, $8, declared raw material cost, and she permitted herself the small, private satisfaction of knowing exactly what she was doing. She had her permit by November. The winter was the education. She processed the first pilot batches through October while the storm-drop fruit was still at its peak, filling 12 half-pint jars that she worked from in November and December and refined against. She learned the orchard's particular arithmetic of sweetness and acid and tannin, learned that the 4 eastern fence trees contributed a brightness that the central row trees could not provide alone, and that the right ratio was 3 parts central sweetness to 1 part eastern tartness, and that this ratio produced something that had, at the back of the palate, a faint ghost of something smokier and older. than ordinary apple butter, something that made you pause with the jar in your hand and think about it. She could not have told you exactly what caused it. She suspected it had something to do with the age of the root systems and the mineral content of the soil, and the particular difficulty of every year those trees had survived, which is to say she suspected Aurelio Vasco had already explained it to her in full. Delphine came by every Saturday through November and December, ostensibly to help with the woodpile and the chickens, actually to monitor the progress of the butter and to offer opinions. Her opinions were direct and useful. She tasted the third pilot batch in late November, thought for a moment, and said, "It needs to cook longer. It needs to be darker." She was right. The fourth batch was darker, and the 5 seconds of silence that followed Delphine's first taste of it was as good a review as Marin had ever received from anyone for anything. There was a child who believed in the work without condition or calculation. That kind of faith does not ask to be repaid. But Marin noted it. She had a habit of noting the things that mattered and keeping the accounting honest. By January, she had refined the recipe to the point where she was confident in it and had moved from half-pint pilot jars to full 8-ounce production jars, which she sourced from the canning supply house in the next county at 14 cents a jar for the glass and lid combined. She was processing in batches of 12 jars using the fruit she had put up the previous autumn in a cold storage arrangement in the root cellar, sealed in crocks under a cider brine solution Aurelio had described to her over the fence in October, a method he said his grandmother had used in the valley and that kept firm fruit usable well into March. She had stored 90 pounds of sorted apples this way. It was, he had told her, a thing the old varieties handled better than the commercial ones. The skin was thicker, he said. The difficulty had taught them something. She ran the numbers in the composition book through January and February. 14 cents per jar for materials, a rough allocation of firewood and labor, and the cider brine prep that she estimated at 9 cents per jar when spread across the batch. 23 cents per jar in declared costs, not counting the 2 cent per apple raw material allocation she had registered with the county, and at a selling price of $1.75 per jar after the fair's 15% vendor table fee. Her net per jar cleared $1.28. 47 jars at $1.75 gross was $82.25. Less the fair table fee of $12.34, net revenue of $69.91 against a total declared cost for 47 jars of $24.41. A return that she wrote at the bottom of the relevant composition book page with 3 underlines, not out of pride, but because she believed in keeping the arithmetic visible and honest. She had not told anyone what the batches tasted like. She had not told anyone about the composition book's numbers or the cider brine or the eastern fence tree ratio or any part of the methodology she had spent the winter developing. When neighbors asked how she was getting on, she said she was getting on fine, which was true in a way that significantly understated the situation. It is easier, she had found, to believe a thing is past saving than to admit you never looked closely. And it is far easier for a community to maintain its settled opinion of a woman and her worn-out orchard than to revise that opinion upward in the absence of public evidence. Marin had no intention of providing public evidence until the evidence was complete and the fair table was set and the jars were in their rows. Made 78 jars through February and March, then stopped because the cold stored fruit was exhausted and the orchard would not offer new fruit until August at the earliest. She labeled 20 of the jars with the paper labels, Caldwell's Grove apple butter, 8 ounces, $1.75, and put them in the cellar. She set aside 12 jars for further personal testing and potential refinement over the summer. She kept the remaining 46 jars in a separate rack and made a note that she was holding them for the October fair. Then she revised upward when she accounted correctly, because she had also managed 4 additional batches in late March, using a second variety from the western end of the orchard she had been underutilizing for years, a greenish apple nobody had ever named, that cooked to a color so deep it was nearly the color of mahogany, and which gave the butter a density and a slight bitterness at the finish that transformed it from something very good into something that required a second tasting to believe. She had 47 production jars ready for the October fair. She had tested, refined, and settled the recipe through 7 iterations. She had Delphine's unshakable endorsement, which she counted, and Aurelio's quiet observation that when he opened one of the tasting jars she had left on his fence post in March, he had eaten half of it before he remembered to look for a spoon, which she also counted. What she did not have, going into the spring and early summer, was any indication that the broader county had revised its opinion of her or her orchard or her plan. Fletcher Dude had been by once in the spring in April, driving the long way around the county road in his truck, and had stopped at the fence to tell her in his warm and faintly condescending way that his offer on the place still stood, and that he was adjusting it upward to 4,600 given what he called the general improvement in land values in the region, and that the orchard was still the orchard, and he wanted her to know she had options. She had thanked him and said the place was not for sale, and he had nodded and driven away. He had stopped at the fence in June too. He said he had heard she was putting up some kind of preserves to sell at the fair, and that he thought that was a fine idea for a hobby, and that the women from the Methodist Church Auxiliary generally did well with jams and jellies, and she might want to have a look at where their table was positioned because the foot traffic in the craft hall was better than near the livestock. She had thanked him again and said she had already arranged her table, and he had nodded again and driven away again. She had wondered, after the second June visit, whether he had heard something he was not letting on. She had wondered, but she had not been troubled by it. The composition book, arithmetic, was settled. The jars were in the cellar. The work was done. The summer brought the thing that rewrote everything, the thing that would, in October, transform Fletcher Dude's jaw into that unhappy working motion and empty Marin's table before noon. It began with a soft rot in the commercial apple orchards north of the county line, a fungal infection that traveled on the wet, cool summer in a way that the county's several large acreage operations, with their uniform modern varieties planted in clean, managed rows, were not constitutionally able to resist. By July, the reports from the northern operations were troubling. By August, they were alarming. 3 of the county's 4 registered commercial apple orchards reported significant crop losses. One of them, a near-total failure of the primary harvest variety. The commercial cider operation that sourced from 2 of those orchards announced in mid-August that it would have no product for the fair. The jam and preserve vendors who sourced their raw fruit from the commercial operations were scrambling. The fair committee, which had planned an entire value-added products showcase around the county's apple harvest, was working through its options with some difficulty. Marin's 63 trees, old and thick-barked and unhurried in their unregistered ways, stood in the north field exactly as they had always stood, heavy with fruit that would begin coming in during the last week of August. The fungal rot had touched only 2 trees on the orchard's perimeter, both of them younger plantings. She and Odell had added 15 years before from commercial nursery stock. The old trees, the ones with trunks like furniture and root systems that had been managing this county's soil since before anyone living could remember, were untouched. She had walked the orchard on an evening in mid-August and looked at the fruit and looked at the sky and thought of Aurelio's sentence, which she had by then said to herself so many times that it had become something like breathing, a thing that happened without deciding to. A tree that has grown hard in a hard place will outlast the softest grove in the county, and what it gives you will carry in it every year of the difficulty it survived. She picked in the last days of August and the first days of September, with Delphine helping after school. working the early varieties first, moving row by row with the picking bags and the sorting bins, and the harvest was even accounting for the storm drop they would inevitably lose to the next weather event. 1. The best she had seen in 3 years on the place. She put up an additional 31 jars through September, adjusted the final count, and arrived at the number 47 for the fair table with 11 jars remaining in reserve, which she had already decided she would not sell at the fair, but would take to the Millhaven General Store on Monday after, if the fair went as she expected it to go. Delphine came to help set the table the morning of the fair, arriving at 6:15 when the hall was still half dark and the vendors were moving in with their boxes and their folding displays. She carried the first case of jars from Maren's truck with the focused seriousness of someone transporting something important, which she was. She set each jar in the row with the label facing perfectly outward. She stepped back and looked at the 47 jars under the hall's overhead lights and said quietly and to herself, as much as to Maren, "They look real good." They did look real good. The mahogany deep jars from the Western variety stood alongside the amber-tone jars from the central rows, and together the 47 of them had the look of something that had been made slowly and on purpose, which was an accurate description of what they were. The fair opened at 8 in the morning. By 8:47 jars had sold to early walkers, who had stopped and read the label and picked up a jar and held it to the light, the way people hold things they are trying to decide whether to trust. By 9:30, the table had lost half its inventory, and a small irregular line had formed in a way that was less a deliberate cue than a consequence of there being more people who wanted a jar than there was space to approach the table casually. Ward travels at county fairs through a mechanism that has never been fully explained to the satisfaction of science. It is not the same as rumor, which travels on anxiety. It is something closer to appetite, which travels on satisfaction. The women and men who had opened a jar and tasted it from the plastic sample spoons Delphine was offering from a dish beside the scale had the expression of people tasting something they were trying to categorize and finding that the nearest category was not quite adequate. More than one person tasted it and then stood still for a moment. One woman, who had been making preserves for 30 years and knew what she was tasting, bought 3 jars and asked Maren what orchard the fruit came from. Maren said the trees were on her place, 11 miles east on the county road, old heirloom variety. The woman looked at her for a moment and then said, "How old?" Maren said she didn't precisely know. The woman bought a 4th jar. By 10:15, 11 jars remained, and the table had attracted a small gathering of people who were not so much browsing as waiting. Delphine was handling the money with the careful, unhurried competence of a child who takes money seriously and does not intend to make errors. She had Maren's tin box and a small handwritten price card, and she made change with the patient arithmetic of someone who has been trusted with a real task. Fletcher Durr appeared at the table at 10:40. He came around the side of the gathering with the particular ease of a man accustomed to arriving at the center of things without waiting in lines, and he looked at the 8 remaining jars and at Maren and at the tin box, and he said, "I heard you were doing well over here." He said it with warmth, which was genuine, and with a slight underlying note of something else that was also genuine, which was the discomfort of a man who has publicly held an opinion and is privately revising it. He said, "These are your orchard apples." Then she said they were. He looked at a jar and said, "I wouldn't have thought those old trees had this kind of output left in them." She said they had more output than they'd been given credit for. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Well, look, I think this is a fine thing you've done here." He said he had been talking to Pete Galloway at the Canning Supply House over in the next county, and Pete had mentioned that someone from the Caldwell place had been buying in bulk, and Pete had said the product was going to be something. He said he'd had Pete looking into it as a possible item for the feed store's small goods shelf. He said the word product. He said the Canning Supply House. He said Pete Galloway had been talking to him about it. He said these things with the fluency of a man who did not notice the detail he had just disclosed, which was that he had been monitoring her supply purchases through a third party in advance of this moment, which meant he knew approximately how many jars she had made before he arrived at this table, which meant that his offer, when it came, which it was about to, was not the spontaneous generosity of a man surprised by quality, but the prepared maneuver of a man who had been tracking the arithmetic all along. It came. He said he thought the product had potential for distribution through the feed store and possibly the hardware and dry goods on Main Street, and that he would be willing to take the remaining jars off her hands this morning at a fair price, and that going forward, he would be interested in discussing a standing arrangement for next season's output through his stores at a wholesale rate of 80 cents a jar, which he noted was a solid price for a value-added product moving through a retail intermediary, and that she would not have to worry about the fair table or the permit application or any of the marketing side of it. He would handle all of that, and the Caldwell's Grove name would be right there on the label. He said 80 cents a jar. She had been listening to him with the same stillness she had worn all morning, the stillness that settled on her when she was doing arithmetic in her head, and the arithmetic was already done. She said, "Fletcher, I appreciate the thought." She said it without heat or edge. She picked up one of the 8 remaining jars from the table and held it for a moment. She said, "I've got 8 jars here at $1.75 each, and I expect they'll be gone before 11. She set the jar back down and said, "The store arrangement. If there's an arrangement, would be at $1.20 wholesale minimum order, 24 jars per month, and the labeling and the recipe stay mine." He said $1.20 was a steep wholesale margin for a small producer without a distribution infrastructure. She said she understood his position. She did not offer another number. He said, "Maren, I'm trying to help you here." She said, "I know you are, Fletcher, and I thank you for it." And she turned to the next person in the gathering and handed them a jar and took their money. He stood for a moment at the side of the table. Then he moved back toward the cider demonstration, and she did not watch him go. The last jar sold at 11:47 in the morning. Delphine counted the tin box twice, then handed the total to Maren, $82.25. Maren counted it once, confirmed it, folded it back into the tin, and closed the lid. She looked at the empty table for a moment, then looked at Delphine, who was watching her with the direct, serious gaze she had had since she was 9 years old, and understood that some things deserved your full attention. Maren said, "You did good work today." Delphine said, "I knew they'd go fast." Maren said, "I owe you for the work this season." Delphine said, "I know," and that was the entire negotiation, which was conducted by 2 people who trusted each other completely and did not need to embellish. On Monday morning, Maren drove the 11 remaining reserve jars to the Millhaven General Store and spoke to the owner, a woman named Getha Prasad, who had run the store for 16 years and who stocked local products on a consignment basis at terms the producers set themselves. Getha tasted a sample jar Maren opened on the counter and said, in a tone that was not theatrical but was definitive, "I'll take all 11 today, and you should tell me what your production capacity is for the spring." Maren said she would have the spring numbers ready by February. Getha said she would hold shelf space. She drove home 11 miles east on the county road, with the empty boxes in the truck bed and the composition book on the passenger seat, and the morning light coming at an angle across the north field that made the old orchard, the one with the arthritic limbs and the unregistered varieties and the thick bark and the root systems nobody had mapped, look exactly like what it was, which was something that had grown hard in a hard place and was not finished. She stopped the truck at the end of the lane and looked at it for a moment through the windshield, the 63 trees in their irregular rows, the fruit gone now, the leaves beginning to take on the dry edge of early October, The limbs that pruning charts would have condemned years ago spread against a sky the color of old tin. Oreo was at his fence line, as he sometimes was in the morning. She got out of the truck and walked over, and they stood on either side of the fence in the cool air. He said, "The fair went well." It was not precisely a question. She said it had gone better than planned. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So, the difficult tree gives, after all." She said, "It gives everything it has survived." He looked at the orchard, and then back at her, and said, "Yes." And that was the sentence, in its full and final form, the one she would carry into every season that followed, the one she would write again at the bottom of a new page in the composition book that winter, the last line of an accounting that was only now beginning to show its true returns. A tree that has grown hard in a hard place will outlast the softest grove in the county, and what it gives you will carry in it every year of the difficulty it survived. The difficulty had been the instruction. The orchard had been the education. And the 47 jars had been the examination, and the examination had been administered in full public view before noon on a Saturday in October, and there were no partial scores and no curves applied. The answer that Maron Caldwell's 31 acres gave back was legible and unambiguous, and written in the deep mahogany color of an apple butter made from trees that nobody had thought worth keeping. She had not answered Fletcher Dode with argument. She had not answered the county with noise. She had answered with the jars in their rows on the long table, the labels in her own careful hand, the tin box and its honest count, and the empty table. She did not mourn. $69.91 net of the table fee, against a declared raw material cost of $8 for 400 storm-dropped apples that the prevailing commercial opinion had valued at 2 cents apiece and written off as waste. This was the arithmetic that the county had not done, because it had not believed the arithmetic was there to do. She had done it. Quietly, through one bad winter and one careful spring and one fungal summer that destroyed the orchards that had always been the ones worth watching, while the old unregistered difficult trees on her north field waited, as they had always waited, unhurried and uncatalogued. One woman alone, 31 acres, 63 trees, older than the county's memory of them. That was not an ending. That was, as she had always known it would be, a beginning.